The King's Fianchetto Opening, an all-purpose system for white and black, by Raymond Keene. In this tape, I want to discuss a method of opening the game which can be used whether you're white or black, which requires no memorization at all and relies more or less totally on an assimilation of general principles. It's based on the fianchetto, that is the development at King's Knight 2, of your King's Bishop. The plan is to set up a regulation position with both colours, which is very secure, very easy to memorize, because the first few moves are standard in each case, one that's solid but also has chances for aggressive potential. Now, the basic moves of the system, which I might add, you don't need to play in a set order, are as follows. From the starting position, let's assume for the moment that we're going to begin with the white pieces. White pawn to g3, white king's bishop to g2, white pawn from d2 to d3, the white knight from g1 to f3, and white castling. This is the basic position, and it's very, very difficult for your opponent to prevent you from achieving this. Now, from this starting position, there are several plans, but most of them have the same strategic goal in mind, and that is to close up the centre or stabilize it in some way, and then to throw forward your kingside pawns and try to mate your opponent. Now, of course, if there's a lot of action going on in the centre, such as, for example, a completely open d-file, then this plan is going to have to be deferred or perhaps modified in favour of other operations. But this is the basic idea, and it consists of moves from this position that we now have on the board of this variety. The Queen's Knight going to d2, the white pawn advancing from e2 to e4, the white knight on f3 moving away, either to h4 or perhaps e1, let's say h4 for the moment, and then the advance of the f-pawn, f2 to f4, maybe on to f5, following up with the push of the g-pawn, and then the gradual transference of all the white pieces over to the king's side to try and deal some dangerous blow against the black king. That's the basic strategy, the ideal strategy. Of course, you won't be able to carry this out in all your games. You should remember that there are no really automatic wins in these systems. In fact, it's not even a good idea to look for automatic wins in chess itself. But the point to bear in mind is that a deeper knowledge of how to handle such systems correctly will help you to score more points, especially if your opponents are not really aware of what you're trying to do. Now let's go back again to our basic position. This means putting the white f-pawn back on f2, the white knight back from e1 or h4 to f3, retiring the white e-pawn from e4 to e2, and putting the white queen's knight back on b1. So you should have the basic structure again: the white pawn on d3, the white knight on f3, white g-pawn on g3, the white bishop on g2, and white castled. Now, I've already outlined one method for white to approach this position, but there are, of course, other methods of bringing your pieces into play and carrying out the same basic aim. For example, a perfectly good method here is to play b2 to b3, put the white bishop from c1 to b2, again to develop the knight to d2, that's the white queen's knight, and now again to try and push in the centre with moves like e2 to e4, moving the white king's knight, and playing f4. Let's go back again to our basic position. Once you've put the pieces back, we have this basic position again. This is the one to bear in mind. White pawn on d3, the knight on f3, pawn on g3, the bishop on g2, and white castled, and all the other pieces at base. White's got another method of launching an attack from this position, and this is just to play his pawn from e2 to e4, and now to pile up energy behind this pawn, perhaps with moves like queen to e2, the white rook to e1, the white knight from b1 to d2 again, maybe transferred to f1, then perhaps pushing the pawn from e4 to e5, bringing the white bishop from c1 to f4, pushing the h-pawn, rather than the f-pawn, which is of course blocked, from h2 to h4, maybe even further to h5, then transferring the knight from f1 to h2, and maybe to g4. And now we have a perfect example of what Nimzowitsch called overprotection. This isn't a passive concept of simply defending a weak point very heavily. The idea is that you select a strategically important point, probably one in your opponent's half of the board, such as the square e5 in this position, and you bring all of your pieces into contact with this point. So we have here in this stylized position the white queen on e2, the rook on e1, the bishop on f4, the knights on f3 and g4. All of these pieces are in contact with this key point e5. And the theory is that this creates a kind of cooperation between these pieces which will be able to unleash a form of energy later in the game. That if they're all in contact with one important point, probably in the centre, these pieces will be able to cooperate far more efficiently for a later attack. And further on in this tape, I'll give an example of this sort of attack in practice. Now let's go back again to our standard position. Retreat all the pieces to their starting positions, apart from the pawn on d3, the white knight on f3, pawn on g3, the bishop on g2, and the castled king. And there's one more point I want you to bear in mind before we start looking at some specific examples. And this is that you don't have to interpret this position, either with white or with black, solely in terms of an advance on the king's side. If circumstances dictate, this is something you'll have to decide as you play the game, it may be a more efficient method to liberate your king's bishop. This is the bishop on g2. This can develop enormous force if the diagonal from h1 to a8 is cleared of all obstructions. This bishop can become a very valuable piece indeed. So you may prefer from this position, remember that this basic position is applicable to both white and black, it's very hard for your opponent to stop you from getting it, that this position can be handled in another way, and that is to thrust at the centre with the move pawn from c2 to c4. And this is very valuable if your opponent has a pawn on d5. You're trying to undermine this pawn, or capture the pawn, or lure this pawn away from the centre. And all of this helps you to enhance the power of this very important piece, the king's bishop. Now, I've spoken in general terms about the kind of position we're dealing with, and now I want to give some examples of white play from this basic position. Of course, not all the games I'll show you will begin with the move order I've shown, because it's a very flexible system and it can start in almost any way. If we go back to the starting position, all the pieces on their initial squares, we'll see that this position can be reached if white plays pawn to d3 on the first move, or pawn to g3 on the first move, knight to f3 on the first move, or in certain circumstances even pawn to e4 on the first move, followed by pawn to d3 on the second move. It could even begin with white playing his pawn to b3 on the first move, although I wouldn't recommend this because black has other ways of countering this, and perhaps seizing the centre before you get round to developing your king's knight. But in some cases that I'll discuss, the move pawn to b3 occurs before white set up the basic position. Now, against this setup, black has various options. He can reply with pawn to e5, placing a pawn on c5 on the first move, playing a kind of French defence based on the move pawn to e6. He can try to barricade your bishop with pawns on d5 and c6. He can play g6 himself, or of course he can simply defend with knight on g8 to f6. But all these systems are very fluid and can transpose from one into the other. So what I propose to do now is to show 3 thematic games where the ideas that I've discussed are thrown into fairly sharp relief. And they're all against different black defensive methods. So I hope this will give you some insight into what we're trying to achieve with white. Now, in the second half of this tape, I'm going to switch over and discuss this opening for the black side. And of course here, if you're black, you're operating a tempo less, one tempo down. So you have to be slightly more aware of theoretical variations. There's a danger, being a tempo down, that white may try to overrun you. He may seize the centre and try and crush you quickly while you're setting up your ideal position. So with black, it's essential to know a little bit more about the theory of the variation as well as the ideas. So in the second part of the tape, I'll simply show one game and then go slightly more deeply into the theoretical nuances of these variations. Now, let's kick off from the starting position with a game which white wins very nicely, impressively, and thematically. The game was played in an international tournament in Moscow in 1971 between 2 grandmasters, the Soviet grandmaster David Bronstein and the East German grandmaster Wolfgang Ullmann. And here we go. White's first move, knight on g1 to f3. Black plays his pawn to d5, seizing the centre. White plays his pawn to g3. Black develops his knight at f6. White plays bishop g2. Black plays c5, taking the centre some more. White castles. Black plays knight c6. And white plays d3. Now, of course, black could play his pawn from e7 to e5. And the correct white reply is the knight going from b1 to d2. Black would play something like bishop to e7. The white pawn goes to e4. Black probably plays his pawn to d4. White would play knight from d2 to c4, attacking the black e-pawn. Black defends, say, queen c7. White plays a4, pawn to a4, a very important move, because you mustn't allow b5, driving the knight away. Now black would probably castle. And here you play the knight from f3 to h4, with 2 important aims. First of all, the knight can jump in at the outpost square f5, and secondly, you clear the way for the standard advance of the f-pawn, f2 to f4, followed by f5, g4, g5, and then try and smash black on the king side. So this is another good example of the standard idea. Let's go back to the game. White a pawn back from a4 to a2. The knight from c4 back to b1. White e pawn back from e4 to e2. White knight from h4 to f3. Now the black pieces, queen back to d8, rook back to h8, king to e8, bishop to f8, black pawn from e5 to e7, and the black d pawn from d4 to d5. So in this game, black opted for the French defence system. He played pawn from e7 to e6 to support d5. And play continued along the standard lines I've shown you already. Queen's knight to d2, bishop to e7, white pawn to e4, black castled, white rook to e1, black pawn from b7 to b5, trying to start a queenside counterattack. And you'll see that in many of these lines, the important thing is to develop the knight, the white queen's knight, at d2 rather than c3, because on d2 it can't be hit by the advance b5 to b4. Also, it transfers to the key square f1 more easily. So white now plays his pawn from e4 to e5, driving away the black knight and creating the kind of overprotection strong point I mentioned earlier. The game went knight to d7, white knight to f1, black attacked on the queen side some more, pawn to a5, white pawn to h4, black pawn to b4, white bishop to f4, all according to plan, bishop to a6, and now the attack begins in earnest. The pieces that are in contact with e5 move into a direct assault on the black king. Knight f3 to g5, queen to e8. Black is trying to defend the e6 pawn and the f7 pawn with his queen. White queen to g4, building up more pieces for the attack. And now black made a terrible blunder. I think that already he has a rather difficult position, because these white pieces are beginning to crowd round his king. But he completely overlooked white's threats here, and this shows you how dangerous these threats can be at quite an early stage of the game. Black played incautiously the pawn from a5 to a4, trying to continue his queenside attack. Now, switch off for a minute, see if you can find white's reply. It finishes the game immediately. Well, the answer is knight g5 takes the pawn on e6. The threat is knight takes rook on f8, and queen takes g7 mate, and knight to c7. So black must capture, f takes e6, queen takes e6 check, forking the king and the unprotected knight on c6. And the upshot is that black loses about 3 pawns, so of course he resigned. So this is a very short game, but it shows the basic plan in action, and it shows how successful it can be very quickly, even against a strong grandmaster. That game was over in a mere 15 moves. Now I'm going to show you another game with the same theme, which was won by Bobby Fischer while he was still active, against the Yugoslav grandmaster Borislav Ivkov. It was played at the tournament in Santa Monica in 1966. Now this game, as I pointed out already, started with a different move order. It begins as a Sicilian defence. White's first move, pawn to e4. Black played his pawn to c5. The white knight went to f3. Black played e6, expecting 3d4 with an open Sicilian, but Fischer tricked him. 3 d3. I remember once I played this move against Bill Hartston in a London Junior Championship. Bill was a great expert in the Sicilian, and I never played e4. And I could see he was very worried even after the second move. And when I played 3 d3, he had a terribly long think and started to get flustered. And I won the game rather rapidly. So I've always had a rather fond affection for this sort of system, since it helped me to win the London Junior Championship. Black played knight to c6. And now Fischer sets up the basic position. Pawn to g3. Black pawn to d5. Now, of course, black's threatening here to capture on e4. White must retake, and then exchange queens. We don't want to exchange queens too early in this system. We want to keep the queen for the attack. So, the knight goes from b1 to d2. And now if black exchanges, the d-file isn't open, so white keeps the queens on. Black played his bishop to d6, white bishop to g2, black knight to e7. That's the king's knight, by the way. And we see here that Ivkov doesn't want to have his knight on f6 attacked by a pawn going to e5. So he develops it in a more cautious square. White castles, black castles. And now Fischer launches the standard attack with no hesitation at all. So this game is an excellent example of the sort of thing I've been discussing. White knight to h4. Black pawn to b6 to develop the queen's bishop. White pawn to f4. And now Ivkov, bearing in mind one of the rules I mentioned at the start of the tape, decided that against this kingside attack, which threatens to overwhelm him completely in just a few moves, it's best to open the d-file to get some sort of central counterplay. Unfortunately, it's not possible to open it enough, and black's best move in this position is probably to play his pawn from f7 to f5, blocking white's f-pawn. White plays his pawn to e5, black bishop goes to c7, and then white would gradually transfer his pieces over to the king's side and try to launch the break pawn from g3 to g4. Well, Ivkov didn't do this, so let's put the black pawn back on f7, the black bishop back on d6, and the white pawn back on e4. Ivkov captured in the centre, d takes e4. Fischer took back with the pawn, d takes e4, maintaining the important pawn duo on e4 and f4, mobile pawns, both threatening to advance. Black played his bishop to a6, rook went to e1, and black played his pawn to c4. The point of this is to free the square c5 for a check and try to pile into the white position using the d-file. Fischer played his pawn to c3, which blocks the further advance of black's c-pawn, which could be annoying. And now the correct move here is rook to c8. But Ivkov, perhaps annoyed or confused by the fact that he couldn't use the d4 square anymore for his pieces, decentralized an important defensive piece. He played his knight from c6 to a5, and we can see now that black's pieces are slowly drifting to the wrong side of the board, because all the action is going to take place on the king's side. Game continued, pawn to e5, liberating the king's bishop, a very important theme, which I've mentioned already. Bishop c5 check, king h1, knight from e7 to d5. And now the attack starts in earnest. White knight from d2 to e4, bishop back to b7, and now queen to h5, a very aggressive move indeed. The white pawn on e5 cuts the board in two, half of black's army is on the wrong side of it, and now white launches a decisive attack, just going straight for black's king. And you'll see that in both the examples I've chosen, there's a very aggressive queen move at quite an early point. Bronstein's queen g4, Fischer's queen h5. And in neither case was black able to repulse the queen meaningfully because of the pawn on e5. And here, if black chases the queen away with g6, as he does soon, it just invites the queen to go further into his guts with queen h6. So, Ivkov now had to retreat to try and cope with this terrible attack. Black knight went back to e7, white pawn to g4, the standard pawn avalanche, which I've outlined in my introductory notes. And now there are terrible threats such as knight f6 check, sacrificing a piece to get a very important and strong pawn on f6, or maybe knight g5. So Ivkov decided he had to get rid of this knight on e4. Bishop takes e4. Fischer's bishop takes back, threatening mate on h7. Bishop g2 takes e4. Now g6 is forced. Pawn to g6. Queen to h6. There's a threat of bishop takes rook. Perhaps the best idea is to move the rook, but Ivkov blocked it with knight d5, taking one more piece away from his king. Pawn to f5. The avalanche continues. The threat is pawn to f6 with mate on g7, another very common theme when you're setting up this kind of avalanche attack. Black played rook e8. He's got to get his bishop back to f8 to stop the mate on g7. But now there's insufficient protection of the square g6, and Fischer finished things off very crisply. F takes g6, f takes g6, and now, if you're going to play this kind of attack, you must be aware of some of the sacrificial themes that finish the game off. Switch off for a minute and see if you can find what Fischer played. The answer, of course, is knight takes g6. If black captures it, h takes g6. White plays queen takes g6 check. If the king goes to h8, queen h7 mate. Or if the king goes to f8, there's bishop h6 check. Or rook f1 check and bishop g5 check. Terrible carnage. Bishop h6 check and queen g7 mate's also not bad. You see, there are so many attacking possibilities once you've broken through that the game almost plays itself. Let's put the pieces back. The white queen back on h6, black king back on g8, black pawn on h7, and the white knight on g6. So black can't take the piece. He could have resigned, but he played on a few more moves. Black queen to d7, white knight to f4, black queen's rook to d8, white knight to h5, black king to h8, white knight to f6, black took, white took back with a pawn, rook to g8, white bishop to f4, black rook takes pawn on g4, he might as well, white rook from a1 to d1. Now black set a little trap, rook from d8 to g8, so that if white takes the queen, rook g1 check. But Fischer, of course, has everything under control. He played his pawn from f6 to f7. Now there's a threat of bishop e5 check, finishing the game off completely, plus the threat of f7 takes g8 check. Black's only move is queen takes f7, and now bishop e5 check forces resignation. A very fine game indeed by Fischer. The final game I wish to show you from the white side demonstrates a rather slower and more ponderous build-up. But in the end you'll see that the themes are more or less exactly the same. Now, one important reason for showing you this game is to explain how white gets the same kind of position, even when he fianchettos his queen's bishop as well. And the second important reason is to show a method of dealing with another very common method of black defense, and that is the barricade against white's king's bishop by means of pawns on d5 and c6. White's first move in this game, which was, by the way, Nimzowitsch against Rubinstein, played at Berlin in 1928, was the move knight g1 to f3. And this is a very good way of introducing this king's fianchetto opening for white, because it stops an important white-black response, namely pawn from e7 to e5. And if you can cut out one black defence, of course it means there's less for you to assimilate, less for you to learn. And it restricts black to less aggressive options. So this is really a very good way of kicking off with the defense, with the opening, one knight f3. Game continued. Black played d5. And now white, as I pointed out before, decided he could get into this position via a roundabout route, and he played his pawn from b2 to b3. Now, the advantage of this in this position is that black can't play e5, so you can set up the basic system more slowly. If you do it on move 1, if you play b3 on move 1, black has the move e5, and then it may be difficult to play knight f3 without having your knight kicked around. Game continued. Bishop to f5. White bishop to b2. Black pawn to e6. Now it's a kind of French defence with the bishop outside the pawn chain. White pawn to g3. Threatening knight h4 in some circumstances, swapping off black's bishop. So black played h6, making a haven for it on h7. White bishop to g2. Black knight to d7. White castled. Black knight to f6, the king's knight, of course. White pawn to d3. Now we've got the basic position on the d to h files, plus the fianchetto of white's queen's bishop on the b file. And of course, white could have done this in another order. He could have played the basic position, as I've shown already, and then fianchettoed the queen's bishop later on. It just so happened in this game that it was played in a different order, but that's not so important. Black played his bishop to e7, and now white played a pawn to e3, pawn from e2 to e3. Now this looks very slow, but the point is that white wants to achieve the advance e4, but it's very difficult because black has so many pieces, the d-pawn, the knight, the bishop, all bearing down on this square. So he has to prepare more slowly to get the move e4 in. Of course, in this position, instead of e3, put the pawn back from e3 to e2, white could have played his pawn from c2 to c4, launching the alternative strategy of clearing the long diagonal for white's king's bishop. Put the pawn back from c4 to c2, white pawn from e2 to e3. We'll carry on with the game. Black castled, white queen to e2, black pawn to c6, reinforcing the diagonal. White king to h1, a very nice move. He just tucks his king away in the corner, preparing for the advance of his kingside pawns. It's often very useful to have the king on this square, because when the position opens up and you move the e and f pawns, black may get a very annoying check on the a7 to g1 diagonal, either with a bishop from c5 or a queen from b6. And this check may represent a very crucial tempo for black, perhaps getting a piece away from an attack with tempo, or generally throwing a spanner in the works of white's attack. So playing king h1 first is a very useful precaution. Black played a5. We've already seen this from the Borenstein-Ullmann game. Here white blocked it with a4. Black played knight c5. White knight from f3 to d4, attacking the bishop, threatening to take it and double black's f-pawns. Black bishop retreated to h7, and white played his pawn from f2 to f4. Here it comes, the avalanche attack. Black played his knight from f6 to d7. White knight developed on d2. Black played queen c7. And now at last we have it, pawn from e3 to e4, with the standard pawn duo on e4 and f4. And here they're very mobile. They can push forwards to e5 and f5, unless black takes stern measures to stop them. Game continued. d takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4 by black, pawn takes e4, threatening to go on to e5, black blocked it, pawn to e5, white played his knight back from d4 to f3, attacking the black e-pawn several times. Black took on f4, he takes f4, and white took back. Now there's a small tactical point here. What happens if black plays queen from c7, takes the pawn on f4? Switch off for a second and see if you can find the answer. Well, it's pretty simple. The knight goes from f3 to e5, discovering an attack on the black queen from the rook on f1, and of course the black knight on d7 is left hanging, so black loses a piece. Put the knight back on f3, black queen back on c7, and give white his poisoned pawn back on f4. Instead of this, black played his rook from f8 to e8. But now white utilised this mobile pawn duo that we see so often in this opening. Pawn to e5, black knight to c5, white knight to d4. The critical point here is once the white pawn's got to e5, it must be supported by pushing the other one on to f5. The colleague has to go from f4 to f5, and once this has been achieved, their further advance, either making a passed pawn or breaking up black's kingside with e6 or f6, is virtually unstoppable. So black has to try and blockade the f5 square, and white has to overcome this blockade, and this is the essential struggle we see over the next few moves. Black knight to e6, white rook to d1, rook a to d1, black took on d4, white took back with the bishop, black bishop to f5, white bishop to e4, black took on e4, white took back with the queen, black rook from a8 to d8, and now the final attack starts. Pawn from e5 to e6, pushing the pawn and attacking g7. Black bishop went to f8, white bishop to e5, queen to c8, white pawn to f5, an ideal position. Black took off the dangerous pawn, f7 takes e6, white pushed on again, pawn to f6. Now we've seen both the disruptive advances I mentioned a few moves ago. Both e6 and f6 have occurred, and black's kingside is near to crumbling. The threat is f7 check, winning a rook. Black took on d1, rook takes d1, f7 check, king h8. Now if white takes on e8, black simply captures on f1 with check, so white took back, rook takes d1. Black played rook d8 to get his rook off attack, but now white can win in one move. Switch off for a second and see if you can find out what it is. Well, this one's not so easy, but white wins very simply, once you've seen it, with the move queen e4 to g6. Black takes the rook on d1 check, the white king goes to g2, black checks again, rook d2 check, king comes up to h3, and black has no checks left, no meaningful checks anyway. Meanwhile, there's a threat of queen g6 takes h6 mate, and there's no way to stop this. A very fine conclusion. In the second part of this tape, I want to discuss this king's fianchetto opening for black. Now, for black, it's obviously more dangerous, because you're missing the tempo of the first move. Black needs more theoretical help if he's going to use this opening. So in the second half, I'm going to give one game and then a little bit more theory to help you through the opening. Now, in all these theoretical examples, we presuppose that white utilises the first move to the fore and seizes the centre. If he doesn't, black gets a fairly easy game. He has the choice of pawn to g6, bishop to g7, and now either pawn to e5 and pawn to d6 with the kind of attack we've looked at already, or putting the pieces back to the starting position, pawn to g6, bishop to g7, and then very fluid development with pawn to c5, knight to c6, maybe the pawn to e6 and the king's knight to e7, followed by simple development of the pieces with a very easy game. That's if white doesn't really take any kind of immediate action in the centre. Of course, there could arise a situation where both sides decide to employ the king's fianchetto opening. And then, the best thing to do is to vary. If white employs the king's fianchetto opening against you and places pawn to e4, you should fianchetto on the king's side and put your pawn from c7 to c5. If your opponent plays the king's fianchetto opening with c4, then you should put your e-pawn on e5. And all of these positions are balanced. It's just a question of taste, of where you decide to launch your attack on the king's side or the queen's side. The important thing is that both sides have a sound position, and if you understand the principles very well, then you'll get the upper hand. Objectively, there's no real advantage for either side if both players use the opening. This is plain logic, and of course this doesn't really need to be explained. But let's assume anyway that your opponents are going to seize the centre, and you're going to defend against this with the king's fianchetto opening. Now, there are two ways of doing this, either with pawns for white on e4 and d4, and the knight on c3, or with pawns on e4, d4, and c4, and then the knight coming to c3. So let's first of all look at a typical sequence where white places pawn to c4, as well as e4 and d4. First move for white from the starting position, pawn to d4, black pawn to g6, white pawn to c4, black bishop to g7, white pawn to e4, black pawn to d6, white knight to c3, black knight to d7, white knight to f3, black pawn to e5. And now the plan here is simply to follow up the black knight going to e7, black will castle, perhaps play h6 to stop a white piece going to g5, and then follow up with the move f7 to f5, with the kind of counterattack we've already seen in operation in the first half of the tape, but with reversed colours. Let's go back to the starting position. Now let's take a look at a sequence which is quite common, where white doesn't move his c-pawn. White pawn to e4 from the starting position, black pawn to g6, white pawn to d4, black bishop to g7, white knight to c3, black pawn to d6, white pawn to f4. This is a pretty dangerous line. White's seizing the whole centre, thrusting forwards his f-pawn, and you've really got to know what to do about this if you're going to survive it. Probably the safest method of handling it is the black knight from g8 to f6, white plays his knight to f3, and now you castle. And if white plays his pawn from e4 to e5, you can simply take it off. You just take off. If white takes back with the d-pawn, you can exchange queens, and then perhaps play knight to h5, or if white takes back with the f-pawn on e5, you can play your knight to d5 with a fairly secure position. Later on, you'll follow up with c5, c7 to c5, and try to undermine white's centre. Put black's knight back from d5 to f6, white pawn from e5 to e4, give white back his f-pawn on f4, and the black pawn on d6. Now with black, since you're a tempo down, and white often gets to seize the centre more quickly, it's much more difficult to get in the advance e7 to e5 than it is to play e2 to e4 with white. So you often have to be content with the second strategy, or rather the final strategy I outlined in the first part of this tape. This is to enhance and liberate the power of the king's bishop on g7 by means of a thrust with the c-pawn. This is often the strategy that you have to adopt, especially when white has his pawns on f4, e4 and d4. Now in this position, the white pawns are on f4, d4, e4, white has knights on f3 and c3, and black has the standard position, the pawn on d6, knight on f6, bishop on g7, pawn on g6 and castled. White has two other normal moves. One of them is bishop c1 to e3, to which the correct reply is pawn from b7 to b6, followed by pawn from c7 to c5. You have to play b6 to support c5, otherwise you lose a pawn. And by doing this, you undermine white's centre, force it to advance, or exchange off on d4, and then you help to break your king's bishop into the game. Put the white bishop back from e3 to c1, the black pawn. This is side 2 of the King's Fianchetto opening. Now, from the position I'm talking about, let's put the white bishop back from e3 to c1, the black pawn back from c5 to c7, and the other black pawn back from b6 to b7. Now, in this position, white has another normal and dangerous move. That's bishop to d3. Now, this develops white's kingside more quickly, threatens to castle, and attack on the f-file very rapidly. So b6 is a bit too slow here. The right plan now is knight b8 to a6, white castles, black pawn goes from c7 to c5. White normally plays d5, and now you play rook b8. And the idea here is to play either knight a6 to b4, or knight a6 to c7, depending on circumstances, and then push forward your queenside pawns. Another thing to bear in mind is bishop from c8 to g4, which gets rid of a very dangerous white attacking piece. That's the knight on f3. White might decide to attack by means of queen e1 to h4 and knight f3 to g5. So if you pin this knight and then exchange it off, you completely rob white of this plan. Now in this kind of position, which is really a Benoni type of position, black has very good chances by pushing his queenside pawns in conjunction with the power of the king's bishop. Often you break through to a weak point on b2, create a passed pawn, or maybe even win a queenside pawn with this scheme. And this position, which has been played by people like John Nunn and myself, is quite playable for black, and there should be fairly good chances. Now let's go back to the starting position once more, and I'll show you one more fairly common theoretical variation. This is called the two knights variation, and it's the one in which it's easiest for black to carry out the basic King's Fianchetto opening plan. From the starting position, white pawn to e4, black pawn to g6, pawn to d4, bishop to g7, knight to c3, pawn to d6, knight to f3, knight to f6, bishop to e2, black castles, white castles, black bishop to g4, white bishop to e3. Of course there are minor variations in all this, but this is the basic setup. Black knight to c6. Now white has several moves. One is pawn to h3, when you simply capture on f3, bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, and now you play e5. And if d5, knight goes to e7, you move your king's knight to e8, and later play f5 with a standard attack. Let's put the pieces back. Black pawn from f5 to f7, black knight from e8 to f6, white pawn from h3 to h2, white bishop from f3 to e2, white pawn from d5 to d4, black knight from e7 to c6, black pawn from e5 to e7, black bishop back on g4, and white knight back on f3. Another move for white here is pawn to d5. Now you play bishop takes f3, white takes back with the bishop, of course, black knight to e5, white bishop to e2, black pawn to c6, white pawn to f4, and black knight back from e5 to d7. And here, black gets counterplay by putting a rook on the c file, his queen to a5, and counterattacking on the queen side. Note that white has weakened his position somewhat. He's loosened the central squares by playing his pawn to f4, and the whole of black's king's bishop diagonal is open for action against black's queen side. I once won this kind of position against the general editor of the tape series, Michael Basman, at a tournament in 1973. Let's put the white pawn back on f2, white pawn back from d5 to d4, black pawn back from c6 to c7, black knight from d7 to c6, black bishop back on g4, and white knight back on f3. So the final move for white in this position is queen from d1 to d2. Black plays his pawn from e7 to e5, the standard move. Now if white takes on e5, d takes e5, you just take back, d takes e5, and this position is pretty level. Usually these positions end as a draw. More aggressive for white, instead of d takes e5, is to play pawn from d4 to d5. But now you play the knight from c6 to e7, you retreat your bishop from g4 to d7, and then carry on with the standard attack, either knight to h5 and pawn to f5, or knight to e8 and pawn to f5. In some circumstances you can even play the knight to g4 and the pawn to f5. And this is the kind of position we already know about. One final thing I should point out before showing a thematic game. Let's go back to the starting position. From the starting position, white sometimes decides to develop his king's bishop on the square c4. And there are two ways of countering this. Let me show you. Pawn to e4, pawn to g6, pawn to d4, bishop to g7, knight to f3, pawn to d6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, knight to c3, black castles. Now if white castles, there's a little trick called the fork trick. You play knight takes e4, knight takes e4, pawn to d5, forking white's two pieces. And you get a perfectly acceptable position out of this. Put black's pawn back from d5 to d6, the white knight from e4 to c3, white pawn back on e4, black knight back on f6, white's rook on h1, and the king on e1. White can stop this in a number of ways. He can play his bishop from c4 to b3, or even queen to e2. And in both cases, black should prepare to blunt the diagonal of the white king's bishop by playing his pawn to c6, either preparing for d5 or perhaps b5. I should point out that in many positions in this king's fianchetto opening, especially when you're black, white has the thrust pawn e4 to e5, just as a general measure. And this can be very annoying for you because it hits your knight on f6, and you may be worried by this. There are many replies to it. After pawn to e5, you can either exchange on e5 or not, and there are going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 separate squares the knight can go to: g4, h5, e8, or d7. And in some cases, after the exchange on e5, it can even go to d5. And I'm afraid that there are no real hard and fast rules for what the correct approach is. You have to look at the position and decide whether you wish to exchange first and retreat your knight, whether you wish to play your knight to the edge of the board, or whether you just wish to retreat the knight without exchanging. Now, one or two guidelines are that if white plays e5 before he's castled, it's probably best to exchange on e5 and then swap queens. Alternatively, if white has played e5 and his king's pawn isn't sufficiently defended, you can retreat your knight from f6 to d7 and put more pressure on the pawn on e5, and either force it to swap off on d6, which is disadvantageous, or go to e6, where it will be liquidated or perhaps even rounded up. This e5 move is one of the problems of using this defense as black, and you have to be very careful about developing your pieces as reasonably quickly as possible to avoid it really gumming up your works. But there's no variation in which it totally refutes black's play if you play fairly sensibly. Well, I've spoken enough about the general principles of this opening, and now I just want to show you one illustrative game to show the same sort of ideas we had for white in operation by black. And this was a game played by the Yugoslav Grandmaster Ljubojevic against the Swiss player Schaufelberger at the World Team Championship in 1972. Schaufelberger was white, Ljubojevic was black. The game went pawn to d4, pawn to g6, pawn to c4, bishop to g7, pawn to e4, pawn to d6, knight to c3, knight to d7, knight to f3, pawn to e5, bishop to e2, pawn to c6, white castled, black knight went to h6. Now white's best move here is the very sharp pawn sacrifice, pawn to c5, which leads to obscure complications after d takes c5, met by d takes e5, when white will probably lose the pawn on e5, but get some development in compensation. Please put the white pawn back on d4, white pawn back on c4, black pawns back on e5 and d6. White didn't play this. He incorrectly played the pawn from d4 to d5. And now, as I said before, if you want to carry out this standard kingside attack, it's best to close the center. So in this position, the move c takes d5, completely opening the center up, would be a terrible positional blunder. Black played correctly, pawn from c6 to c5. And although it loses a move, black's pawn's gone from c7 to c5 in 2 moves instead of 1, the closing of the center is far more important. Black now gets a free hand to push forward his f-pawn and start a kingside attack. White played rook b1, black castled, white bishop to d2, black pawn to f6. He doesn't want to play pawn to f5, while white still has knight g5 available. That could be very annoying for him. So he prepares to play his knight from h6 to f7, and then f5. White now blundered again. He played his knight from f3 to e1. So, of course, black has no problems. Knight g5 isn't available. He played f5. This is a very curious game. Black plays pawn from c7 to c6 to c5, and pawn from f7 to f6 to f5, losing 2 whole moves. But the force of this attack with the f-pawn is so strong that it doesn't matter. White played his knight to d3. Black played his knight to b6. Now, probably the best move is b3, but white played knight c1, which is a rather funny way of defending his c4 pawn. And now black has 2 very good methods of continuing the attack. One is the pawn to f4, followed by pawn to g5 to g4, and queen h4. Please put the pawns back to f5 and g6. And one is the method in the game, which is also very good indeed, and shows the same kind of ideas in practice, but black decides to use the open f-file instead of the avalanche method. Black took an e4, white took back. bishop to f5, pawn to f3, bishop takes on e4, pawn takes back, and now the aggressive queen move, one of the hallmarks of this variation, queen to h4. We saw it in Fischer-Ivkov, we saw it in Bronstein-Ullmann, and now again in Schalpenberger-Lebovic. White played bishop d2 takes knight on h6. Not a very bright move. He was probably trying to get opposite coloured bishops and hope to draw. But now, another theme emerges, the liberation of the fianchettoed king's bishop. This can be a real demon once it gets into the game, as it does here. Bishop takes h6 back. Queen to d3. Rook takes f1 check. Bishop takes f1. Rook to f8. Pieces are converging. The threat is queen f2 check and queen takes f1 followed by mate. White knight to b3. Queen to f2 check. King to h1. Knight to a4. White queen went to e2. And black played his pawn to b6. And in this position, white resigned. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that he really has no decent moves left at all. One of black's threats is to play his bishop from h6 to e3, forcing the exchange of queens, after which a rook comes into f2, and white loses his b-pawn. Black's bishop is really a tower of strength. It has the freedom of all the dark squares, while white's bishop's a feeble creature on f1. Even if white didn't resign in this position, and I must say most people would try and struggle for a few more moves, his position is still pretty horrible. And from a theoretical point of view, black can be very, very happy with the outcome of this game. Now, I think you have enough basic material to employ this opening with both colours, but before I finish, I want to recommend two of my books which go into this variation in much greater detail. Of course, I think you've got enough here to play it in your own games, but if you want to make a real study of these openings, there's my book Flank Openings, published by the BCM, which deals entirely with fianchetto openings from white's point of view, and there's my book The Modern Defence, written with George Botterill, which goes into the whole question of when black can play these g6 defences. And I think, having said this, you should be fully equipped to play the defences in your own games. Okay?